Welcome to Socio-Witchery, a show about magic and meaning making. I'm Stacy, sociologist, witch, and energy worker. I'll be talking about how to deepen our craft and our lives by unpacking the meanings and exploring the meaning-making strategies underneath magic and all kinds of magical workings. Today's show is about what makes a space sacred. It's a wee bit academic, but I hope you'll gain insight and inspiration about deepening the sacredness of your magical spaces. I also share a couple of slightly embarrassing stories about my working altar and talk a bit about the relationship of the sacred to practical magic in particular. Let's unpack and explore. So first I want to talk about the idea of the sacred versus the profane, which is, we think of this as a binary in general, a dichotomy that comes out of sociology. It comes from Emile Durkheim's ideas about sacred beings being by definition separated beings. Durkheim wrote that this, I think, in the elementary forms of religious life, which would make sense, that what characterizes sacred beings is that there's a break in the continuity in how we view sacred beings and non-sacred beings. So it gets set up as a binary where if profane is not sacred and sacred is something other than profane. And I think this is really interesting in the context of a lot of practical magic, for example, lots of magic, but especially today in sort of the practical magic identity and practical witchcraft, we see that binary being challenged, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So for a lot of us, the first thing we want to do when we really get serious practicing the craft or when we are really interested in the identity is find a way to make an altar. Or maybe if you're not quite there, then thinking about a meditation space or some kind of spiritual space. And so we think about that mostly, I think most commonly in terms of physical first, right? Where we're going to put this space. And in keeping with the sacred profane binary, we're thinking about the boundaries between this space and the rest of our space. A lot of us want to make our altar special. We want to make it feel not like the rest of our room or house or wherever we're setting up this altar, right? If you don't have space or can't be out about your craft, then maybe you've got a special box or a special chest or a bin, but we're making it special by saying this is different. We're putting brackets around it. So we do this physically. Where it is, where do you want to put it? Where do we visualize that our space begins and ends? So if we do have an altar table or bench or something like that, where do we see the boundaries of that sacredness? Does it end at the physical object? Does it end where we normally cast our circle? And so these kinds of thoughts, even if they're not conscious, I think are operating when we try to create our sacred spaces. We're bracketing, in a physical way, we're bracketing our space. And then it's also about meaning making. And here I'll veer just a little bit into academia, talk about a branch of sociology called symbolic interaction, which is where I come from. And symbolic interaction is based on how we make meaning. It's based on the meaning making process. It's based on the work of George Herbert Blumer, who wrote that symbolic interaction has to do with three things, and all of them are wrapped up in objects and meaning. So I'm just going to describe them really quickly because they become relevant in what I want to talk about creating our sacred spaces. But Blumer says that we act toward things on the basis of the meanings that we have for them, and that these meanings are derived from social interaction. That's where we get the meanings from. And that we then handle and modify these meanings through the interpretive process we use when we're dealing with these objects. So for me, this is really core to setting up an altar or any kind of sacred space, but I'm going to focus on altars today because our altars are really about meaning-making processes as well as setting boundaries around a space to designate it as sacred. So when we want to create a sacred space, we need to do one, set boundaries up for this space, and two, create meaning, construct it to have the sacred meaning that we want. But the last piece, I think, of creating sacred space in the context of the binary, that sacred is what is not profane, and profane is what is not sacred. And profane really just means every day. It means that which we do not elevate to some sort of special status. You know, that at least today in a more secular society, that's how we're thinking about the profane. But the third aspect of creating sacred space is about narrative. It's about the stories that we tell ourselves and sometimes to other people about our space, about what it's for, about how we're going to use it. And so we have this kind of division between the sacred and the profane in whether it's worldly and whether it's something otherworldly or extraworldly or special aspects of our world. We see this binary also, come to think of it, in the tarot. If you're working in a school that uses 3 septenaries, I know some people work in schools that do 11 and 11 and keep the Fool out. But if you're working with tarot in 3 septenaries, that first septenary from the Magician to the Chariot, that's about the mundane. And mundane is also the profane. So even though we're working with a medium that we might think of as sacred and work with as sacred and view as sacred, we're also dividing what's sacred and what's profane, right? And then that third septenary would be the most sacred. And then that middle one, right, the unconscious, is kind of, the mediary between the two. So we see this all over the place in a lot of things that we do, creating sacred space and sacred ideas and going through this process where we bracket off and say, this is something different from the regular. This is something special. So I'm just going to tell a little story about how I came to create my major working altar. I live alone and I have two small altars and one main working altar. And I created this when my daughter went away to college, and we have not a lot of space for things like altars, or we had not a lot of space for things like altars. I have some more space now, but there really wasn't any place to put something. But we did have an old piano that I had gotten for free on Craigslist many years ago when my daughter was very interested in the piano, and she became less interested in the piano over the years. And then arrived at a point where she was comfortable with me getting rid of the piano. But if you've ever tried to get rid of a piano, especially from a second floor apartment, you will know that it is not an easy feat. And so I had been searching for months to find someone who would donate it to charity. I didn't want it junked if I could avoid it. I couldn't find anybody. And then finally I found some internet deal, but it turned out to be a bait and switch. So I had to keep the piano, and that bummed me out because I wanted to use the space where the piano is to create an altar. So you see where I'm going with this, right? I converted this old piano into an altar, and that wasn't my first choice. I wanted the dedicated special altar. I wanted to spend more money and participate in the capitalist economy and create my own space from scratch. So I had a little bit of work to do on several levels when I created this as my working altar. I needed to shift some things around in how I thought about it. I needed to imbue it with new meaning. I needed to do things that would make it, for me, a sacred object rather than this old thing that was high time to get rid of. And I'll come back to how I did that in a little while. But so now the piano, which is really the first thing you see when you walk into my living room, and it's kind of front and center, is my only working altar. The other 2 altars are for other purposes, which I'll get to in another episode, I'm sure. So I had this big piano and I wanted to turn it into an altar. And I didn't think about, just to be clear, I didn't think about all the things I'm saying now. I didn't say, okay, Durkheim said that I need to make this not profane. I didn't do any of that. I just did what we all probably do when we create an altar, which is, oh, yay, I'm going to make my altar. And then I found things that I wanted to add to it. And I gave some thought to what things meant. And I did what we all do. It's only later, in retrospect, where I'm thinking about that process and unpacking it in terms of how it is that we make meaning and create things that we feel are sacred. Because making an altar for, I think, a lot of witches changes us. Your first altar, or maybe your second, or when you're changing it and making it into something that has a different function, or as your witchcraft evolves, it changes who we are and how we relate to the world. And it's a really profound process for a lot of us. And so I began thinking about it. And once I started unpacking what the processes were that I was engaged in, that's how I started thinking about this. So I didn't want you to think that I sat there and I opened my Bloomer books and said, okay, how do I create an altar? I just made an altar. Okay. So in creating sacred space, whether it's an altar or some other kind of space, there's the sacred and profane binary. I think that we're first, that's kind of the immediate thing we're doing, is saying that something needs to be special and different, and it needs to have meaning to me, and it's wrapped up in the stories I'm telling myself, right? Those could be identity stories, like I now practice magic, or they could be I'm taking control of my life, right? They could be action stories, but the stories we tell ourselves are part of that process. And then the second way that I think about this is that the sacred especially today in a more secularized, at least in some ways, society. I mean, I could talk for hours on whether we are in fact more secular than we were 300 years ago, but in many ways we are. And I think that today's sacredness really is becoming, and a lot of it is through feminist progress and through the changes in witchcraft and in self-work and self-care and all of this. But it's becoming, I think, intertwined with a kind of intimacy with the self, intimate relationship with the self that we are conscious of differently than we used to be as people and cultivating differently. I'm still just really beginning to think about this. And my first book deals with intimacy and what we mean when we talk about intimacy between people. And I think intimacy is about transgressing boundaries with other people, that when we talk about intimate experience, we mean instances where with another person we crossed some meaningful boundaries. And when that happens, we think of it as intimate. There's a lot more to it than that, obviously, but when I think of intimacy, I think about boundary transgression. And so self-intimacy is interesting, the idea that we're cultivating an intimate relationship with ourselves, because how do you cross boundaries with yourself, right? How does that work if it's just you? But I do think that there is an element to creating our sacred space that means that we are working with ourselves to cross some kind of boundaries. And those boundaries obviously are spatial, as in, okay, I'm going to designate this space. And when I step to my altar, or when I open up my closet or the box that is in, or when I cast my circle, I am, in a sense, joining myself in this bounded space that I've designated as sacred. So that's the more obvious level. But I think there are a lot of ways that it parallels how we think about intimacy. For example, when we create sacred space, one of the things we often do that I think is important for a lot of us, though not all, but I think there's an aspect to controlling the usage of the space, which is what monogamy is based on. It's about what is intimate between two people is what only I have. If you tell me something that you don't tell any of your other friends, then that's a kind of indicator for me that we have some intimacy. Secrets and disclosures are all wrapped up in what we understand as intimate between people. And so in a way, we do this when we control the space that we use. Many of us say, okay, I'm only going to use my altar for magic, or only I am going to use my altar, or members of my coven or friends of mine, and I'm only going to do my magic here, which I think is less common these days in the context of practical magic. And I'm going to do it at times that I am designating as sacred, and I'm going to use it for these ends. So we're controlling the who, what, where, when, and how of how our space is being used. And again, not in all instances, but for me, this was important. For me, maybe especially because it was a piano in the middle of my living room. It's actually the back of my living room, but it's definitely a focal point. And for me, saying, yes, this is a piano in my living room, but it is sacred space, it was very important to say, this is special, this is magic. And so I don't have a lot of surface space to just set things down. And I had to do a lot of, wait, I just put my phone down on the altar, or somebody would set their drink there and I'd say, oh, no, you can't put it there. And so I was really policing using this conspicuous place to set things, as I was policing the use of that and saying, no, people, you can't use that for that. I can't use that for that. Even sometimes now when I'm doing a spell, I'll have something in my hand that is not sacred to me or not magical, or something I think of as really mundane for whatever reason. And I have nowhere to set it. And it bothers me to set it down on the altar, and I'll turn around and I'll put it on the couch because I'm heavily invested in constructing that space as sacred. Now, I know that for a lot of you, that just sounds ridiculous, and I completely get that. I'm not that way with my altars in my more private spaces. And so I do think it has something to do with the understanding culturally of what a piano is. That has meaning for people. You can't use my piano as I took off the knobs and I changed it structurally, but you can still see that that's what it is. And so part of it is a way to signify, this is not what you think it is. This is something special. So this boundary drawing that we do, and I'm not, again, you may not be doing it in any way, and certainly not in my way, but I would encourage you to think about the ways in which you might be drawing boundaries around your space in order to understand it as sacred for yourself. Because I do think that boundary drawing is a way that we construct a space as sacred or not. Even all this time after Durkheim thought that the profane was that which was not sacred and vice versa, I think we still do that to create the idea of space as sacred. And this is related to semiotics and aesthetics, which I'm not going to get into because I'm not a philosopher and I don't know very much about these areas. But symbolic interactionism is closely related to semiotics, which is the study of signs and symbols and how we represent and understand things. And aesthetics is the study of art and beauty and how we understand those things. And so those are closely related when we're talking about building altars, because most of us want altars that we like the look of. And we also want altars that have these meanings for us, these sacred meanings for us. And so the second step then after we're and I'm not saying that this is sequential, that first you do this and then you do this. This is just how I'm thinking about it. So just for argument's sake, another step is when we go about the aesthetics of it. What do we want it to look like? What appeals to us visually? What do we think is pretty or cool looking? And that is an important part for many of us. And that's based on shared understandings, right? Pinterest and Instagram help us with this, and books on altars and our friends' altars. And then there's also all sorts of categories that we use, cottagecore and Gothic and eclectic. And these all denote particular styles and particular aesthetics. And when we create our altar and engage in the process of making it feel the way we want to feel and we want it to feel, we're also engaging in a process of assigning and imbuing more meaning to that aesthetic itself and to the particular objects that we're using. So we're in keeping a particular aesthetic to which we've attributed meaning, we're also constantly in the cycle of reproducing that meaning. So this object means something to me. I put it on my altar. Now my altar has more meaning. Now this thing is on my altar that has more meaning and it has meaning, right? This is how charging works for us, the idea of charging, whether it's crystals or our tarot decks or whatever. By putting this one thing that has meaning with this other thing that didn't have as much meaning, there's a dialectic, a kind of back and forth that increases or deepens the meaning that we've attributed to it. So I think that that's really interesting and definitely part of the process of creating a sacred space. And I think that what's really interesting about it, or at least another thing that's really interesting about it, I think everything is interesting, but I think another thing that's really interesting about it is the lengths that, and again, not all of us. I mean, I've known people who are just really casual about it, right? Like, oh, I'm going to put this here. And they may not be giving it any conscious thought. Maybe they're not giving it any subconscious thought. Maybe they don't work the way that I work. And I totally get that. But I think, because I'm a sociologist, so I think that underneath for a lot of us, there are these meaning-making processes and these strategies that we deploy in order to do what it is that we want to do. And those processes and strategies interest me. But I think it's really interesting that sometimes, and I've seen other people do this, although I'm having a hard time coming up with an example of their doing this, but I do have several for me. But I will go to lengths to engage in that process by which I assign meaning and imbue meaning and even change the meaning. What am I talking about? So sometimes you might have liked something and thought, oh, maybe I'll put that on my altar. Or, I have this other thing. Maybe my altar is a good place for this. But something might have held you back. You might have said, well, it has this other association that I don't want. And so then maybe you wrestled with it. Maybe you got something similar for your altar, or maybe you forewent it and you did something else. Or maybe you did what I'm going to describe, which is a whole bunch of kind of mental trickery to get what you want the way you want it and not make as many trade-offs. I think for me, that's really a piece of this. I'm not very good at making trade-offs. I don't like trade-offs. I'm very idealistic, and I think that there must be a way to have it all the way I want it. And that costs a lot of time and labor, by the way. I do not recommend this as a way of life. But I think that the effort that I will go to make different meanings so that I can have what I want might be a little unusual, to put it kindly. But here's an example. When I was in the early days of converting my piano to a working altar, I was out thrifting every week to just be open to what I might see. I didn't go and say, oh, I want this and I want this and I want that. I mean, I had a few things I knew I wanted and I had things that were already there. But I was really just kind of opening myself to the world to see what might pop up that would feel right or would help me construct the aesthetic I wanted. And and just trying to figure out who I wanted to be at that point in my witch journey. And I was at a thrift shop, and I saw a really beautiful metal. It was a piece of art created by a metal worker, I later learned, which was part of the process. And it was made of, I think, tin and bronze, and it was a cross, like on a stand, probably about 8 or 9 inches high. And it was teal and turquoise, and I like those colors. I know it like splits the universe, teal and turquoise, kind of like cilantro, but I like teal and turquoise. And I just thought it was really pretty. But I don't like crosses, and I identified, and again, still don't know that I don't, but I was an atheist, and a pretty rabid one at that. An organized religion is not my jam, and crosses to me meant Christianity. So I was like, oh, that's a shame, because that's really pretty, and aesthetically it's totally my style. It was funky and kind of bohemian, and it was my colors. And it was kind of cheery looking and not at all like morose or somber. And so, but it kind of had a gothicness to it. And I just really liked it. But crosses mean Christian, and I am not Christian, and I don't want Christianness on my altar, is how I felt. So I had decided not to get the cross. And then I circled the thrift store like 6 times. And each time, of course, I came back to that cross and picked it up again. And so I was like, you know what? It's like $1.50. I can afford $1.50, thankfully. And so I picked up the cross, and I said, well, even if I don't, maybe I'll just cleanse the hell out of it, and, no pun intended, and then I'll want it in my altar. Or even if I don't, then I'll redonate it. If I don't pick it up, it's not an option. So let me go home and see what happens. So I picked it up, and I went home, and I was unpacking everything and smudging everything, and took it out, and I really didn't want it on my altar, but it was so pretty. So then I did this deep dive into trying to figure out who. It's kind of embarrassing to admit the lengths I will go to, but I did this deep dive into this item. There was an artist's signature on the bottom of the work. So who is this person that made this cross, and are they furthering Christo-fascist causes? Am I representing this world that I think is very dangerous right now? What's happening with Christo-fascism? And so I needed to know, who is this person, and what is the chain of meaning that I am involved in by acquiring and using this cross. Again, I'm not saying anyone else does this, at least this particular aspect. I'm saying this is an example of a pretty extreme meaning-making process and strategy, an attempt that I'm sharing with you to illustrate how extreme it can be. Anyway, I did all this research. And I found that the artist who did the cross was really actually pretty cool and alternative. And while he did do, it's a Celtic cross, which I knew a little bit about, but not a whole lot about. So that sent me into the research on Celtic crosses. And between those two kind of investigative meaning-making processes, I came away, this artist was cool. He was like a jester sometimes. He was just really kind of funky. And he did a lot of Celtic crosses, but he did a lot of other things, Gothic architecture stuff, if I remember correctly. And then I was able to, through some internet research, convince myself that there is at least a long-standing theory that Celtic crosses predate Christianity, even though they changed in use and popularity post-Christianity. I could get next to that they were pre-Christian. And this was all very, very important to me because of the associations that I have with Christianity. But I really liked the cross, but I couldn't just plop it onto my altar at the time because this was really my first attempt at a major working altar. And it was part of a process of integrating who I am with more public parts of my space. It was a whole big thing. And so I was not in a place where I could just say, screw it, and plop this cross on my altar without going through all this rigmarole. But I did go through the rigmarole, and I thought that what I was doing was interesting. And I did, of course, smudge the hell out of it. But now it occupies a place on my altar, and it is part of the sacred meaning. And I no longer look at it and have any kind of ambivalence. And now it's important to me as part of my working altar. So that's just a little story. I don't know if anyone has similar stories to share about meaning-making hurdles that you may have gone through or things that you rejected because they weren't quite right. But I think that there is interesting stuff there. So then the next aspect that I think is a really important part of creating sacred space is cultivating an emotional or spiritual or both relationship with that particular space. So now we understand our space, our altar, or our meditation corner, or whatever is the sacred space for you, the corner of the closet. And we understand it as sacred. And now we have engaged in behaviors and actions that reinforced its sacred nature. So that's an important piece of it. Once we designate a space or an object as sacred, there's kind of an upkeep that has to happen, I think, for most people to continue to view it as sacred. I don't think there's a particular deadline that, after 1 week, but I think over time, if you're not engaging in these behaviors and actions that continually reinforce that meaning for you, then it can lose its sacredness. I know for me, it happens frequently with crystal grids. So if I set up a crystal grid and I imbue it with all this meaning, and then I go a couple of days where I forget to activate it or I forget to just clear it off, and pretty soon it's just a dusty pile of rocks on my shelf and it loses its meaning to me. So part of keeping it feeling sacred, you probably do stuff like this, or at least some of you, if you've not done magic for a while, and you suddenly get inspired, you're going to do a spell or you're going to do a ritual, and then you go over to your space or your altar, you realize, oh, you know what, these all need a cleansing or a charging, or those things, cleansing and charging, are a way of us keeping our space sacred. They're a way that we stay in touch or in tune with the sacred energy that we want to work with. And when we go long periods without doing that, many of us feel the need to kind of give it a little boost, a little zap. And what we're zapping and boosting and charging is not merely our crystals or our cards or our candles, but also our relationship to this endeavor as sacred. So we're understanding this space as sacred. We're engaging in these behaviors and actions that reinforce that sacred understanding. We are appreciating it aesthetically, right? We're into how it looks, how it feels, and how it smells. And we've linked all of those, more kind of sensory experiences to the notion of the sacred. You know this if let's say you have particular incense you burn when you're doing magic work, or maybe you just always burn some incense. And then in another context, when you smell incense, that's going to bring some of that feeling back to you. So that's just a small example. I mean, I think this happens for everybody. It's just about cross situational associations. So we've done all that. And so then the process requires, and again, then maybe not sequentially, just breaking it down this way, but then we need to create or at least reinforce an emotional connection to the space, our relationship to the space on an emotional and or spiritual level. And so this is very personal, and what your relationship and what your feelings about your space are going to be are probably going to be different from mine. But some examples are joy and love and reverence, awe, gratitude, appreciation, all of these kinds of emotional connections and feelings that we have toward our altars, toward our spaces. And so it's on us when we create our space and use our space to create and cultivate these relationships. It's not as if once we've put all of our objects on our thing and done our stuff and gave it a good smudge and a good blessing that boom, now it feels that way. We're engaged in constant interactive processes that make it feel that way. So I think that, of course, is very interesting. So I think we do that in a few ways. And that is one of the last things that I want to talk about how we create our space. Another thing that's maybe slightly embarrassing, because I don't know how many people do this, but I take certain actions to interact with my space. It personifies it in a way. I'm not saying that I think of my altar as a person, but it makes me happy, and I am inclined very frequently to greet it, to say, good morning. I have to pass my altar to open my living room curtains. So on the way to the curtains, sometimes I'll say hi, or I'll just smile at my piano like an idiot. But that's what I do, because I feel the joy as I see it, and I feel the appreciation and the gratitude for the energy there and for the work that I've done there and for the things that all of these things taken together have brought me. So greetings and smiling and giving thanks to are all actions that, that people might take to continue to cultivate that emotional relationship, because personifying it is a way of cultivating emotional relationships. That's what we do with pets and with objects that we have special attachments to, et cetera, et cetera. And then another way that people often create or reinforce their emotional connection to their space is by offerings to deities or animals. I don't work with deities, so I haven't done this, but I know that that's a major way to personify the work and to feel emotionally connected. So maybe you don't say hi to your altar, but you leave food out for your deities. And then that bridges a gap between, your internal experience and your external symbols for emotion or catalyst for certain emotional experiences. And that's a way that we animate it. We animate our altar, or we animate our space, or we animate our magic through offerings. And then I think there's the caretaking of the altar, which I think most of us probably struggle the most with because life is busy. And I think, again, some of this is limited. For some people who identify as practical magic practitioners, the caretaking aspect is not necessarily an important part of keeping it sacred because this relationship to the sacred is different. But for those of us who compartmentalize and draw boundaries and are working within the sacred versus the profane dichotomy, caretaking can be another way that we generate that emotive kind of connection, that when we dust it or when we clean off the wax or move the crystals about so that they don't sit in the same place and create a little outline, when we cleanse it energetically, it feels a little stale. So we might ring the bell, or we might sage it or smudge it or whatever. So these are all ways that we're nurturing the space. And because we've designated the space as sacred, and because we've cultivated an intimate relationship with it, and because we feel emotionally connected to it, it also is a kind of nurturing of the self, because at that point it's an extension of our identity and our selfhood and what means a lot to us. And so that kind of caretaking is another way that we continue reinforcing the sacred relationship. And obviously, if it's a working altar we're talking about, then any spell work, any magic we do there is going to be also reinforcing the notion of the sacred and cultivating that emotional relationship, because most of us love to do magic and it brings us joy and gratitude and all the things that I'm talking about, reverence and awe when the spells work, and et cetera, et cetera. So the magic is the primary way that we're cultivating the emotional relationship. And then lastly, sharing our altar or our sacred space with others. And this, again, too, I think is fascinating because the community is split on issues around this. I think there are lots of dimensions to it, aspects that might be generational and also might be Wicca versus non-Wiccan practitioners, and lots of elements to it. And I think this works in two completely opposite ways. In both ways, I think there's a piece that is about that emotional connection to our space and the intimacy that we feel with it in particular. So for people who take photos of their altar and post them on Instagram or Pinterest or send them. So some of us share what our sacred spaces look like, and some of us do not share what our sacred spaces look like. And I think in both instances that's about intimacy and the emotional connection to our sacred space. So in the case of people who want to share what their altars look like, I think that there's something to the idea that when we disclose, it comes back to that idea that you're telling a secret to someone. And this isn't a secret, but you are targeting, in many cases, who you're going to show it to. Or maybe you're telling everybody, maybe you're giving everybody this disclosure. And so it's not about these people and not those people, but it is about taking something that's intimate to you or important or special to you and sharing it with others, which can be very connective. And when we share things that are important about us, identity pieces, for example, right, which for many of us, our altars are at least related to our sense of identity. And when we share that with other people, then that can help foster a connectiveness to other people and share connections. And in so doing, that makes the altar itself or the sacred space itself a mechanism or a medium for building intimacy and connectivity with other people. I show you a picture of my altar and I'm saying to you, come inside and look a little bit closer at me. And so I'm letting you in, I'm reaching you, there's a connection, there's an intimacy that I'm now kind of trying to foster or deepen by sharing it with you. And my altar becomes a partner in a broader sense in that effort to be understood, to be recognized by people. The altar becomes a prop and a tool, but also because of my special relationship with the altar, somebody who is an ally with me in reaching out to the world and saying, look who I am. So I think that sharing can be a kind of intimacy move in that sense, but the goal there is intimacy with others. And the intimacy with the altar is part of the process of growing intimacy with others. And then people who are not disclosing, there's a whole discourse on whether we should be keeping our altars to ourselves and that they're private, and that to put them on Pinterest or Instagram lessens or denigrates or damages the sacred aspect to it. It makes it profane, is the argument, right? Like, I have this sacred thing and I take pictures and I spread it all around, and then that makes it less sacred. And so I think that people who don't share what their altars look like on principle, not because they just never thought of it or you just don't feel like it or whatever, but on principle, I think that that functions to keep the space private and yours alone. We know, which goes back to the boundaries that I was talking about earlier, controlling not only who can use it, but also who can see it, and reinforcing the idea that this is for me, this is deeply personal, and this is mine, and I don't need everybody or want everybody to have access to this deeply personal, deeply special thing. And that, of course, can intensify the intimacy of your relationship with the space. So I think in both cases, when people do and don't share, there is potentially, anyway, not always, but potentially is an intimacy piece there. And the difference is, am I using my sacred space to boost my connection with other people and therefore feel more understood and feel more intimately known? Or am I using my sacred space to cultivate a deeper intimacy with myself, a deeper relationship with myself that I'm keeping private? But I think that they're very similar in terms of psychology and emotionality and what we're after, just directed differently. So barring practical witchcraft, which I'm going to get to now, I think that about covers what I think is involved in our creating sacred spaces and ways that I hope might be useful and interesting as you go about creating and altering and changing your sacred spaces. Because my perspective, and this might not be yours, but if you've listened this far, it might be, my perspective is that these layers of meaning, the deeper we dig and the more layers of the processes that we engage in, only serve to deepen our sense of sacredness. They deepen the reverence and the awe and the love and the joy, the better we understand what we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're doing it. At least for me, the more I understand about the strategies that I'm deploying to make this work for myself, the more I appreciate the results and the deeper the connection and the more joy I find in what I do. Not everybody is like that. I certainly have friends who the more they analyze something and pick something apart, the less fun it is for them, because that feels like work and a burden and not a good use of their time. And that's very different than how I approach it. Hopefully, some of you will get something out of some of my thoughts on the process. But about practical witchcraft, I wanted to say a couple of words and then really just toss out some questions in the hope that I can begin thinking about this differently. I've seen two major discourses on what exactly is meant by practical magic or practical witchcraft or the identity practical witch. And I'm not doing a taxonomy here. There's a whole bunch of differentiations. But one definition is that practical magic is that which is focused on effects in the real world. You want to impact the real world. So you want a promotion or you're doing a love spell, and that's practical magic. And that's one understanding. And then there's another understanding out there, and I don't know the extent to which these two overlap or whether they're just two very different takes on practical magic. But the other understanding is that practical magic is about infusing magic into the everyday. When you sweep your floor or you use your regular broom, and that's a magical act. I think this is probably really common in kitchen witchery, is my guess. But the idea that it's all magic and everything is a spiritual act and everything is a magical act, so that you don't need these false dichotomies or these false brackets between the profane and the sacred. And that's a different understanding of what practical magic is, but not incompatible with it impacting the everyday world. I don't really quite get the practical magic definition about impacting the regular world, because I thought that most of us were looking to do magic that impacts the world on some level, right? If we define the world broadly enough. So I'm a little confused there. So maybe somebody can help me with that. But in any case, this second camp, the idea that practical magic is about infusing the sacred with the everyday, so that you're the same knife that you're cutting your radishes with, you're also using in your magic work. That's really interesting to me, because it represents a kind of queering of the boundary between the sacred and the profane, where queering means, I should probably clarify, when we talk about binaries and blurring the line between dichotomies, We often call it queering because that comes out of queer theory and doing that with gender, which, started about 40 years ago in queer theory, 35, 40 years ago. So when I talk about people who are engaged in a process that says, listen, it doesn't have to be this or that. It's not gay or straight or black or white or man or woman. That's a kind of queering of the binary. So all instances of trying to fight dichotomous thinking can be called a kind of queering. So I think that's really interesting because that take on practical magic is a kind of queering of the sacred profane binary. But I'm really interested in how that works and what role, if any, does the idea of the sacred play, because it's the idea that all things are sacred, which for me would take an awful lot of meditation to live that way, like to constantly, that must be some serious being present in the universe over the course of 24 hours. And I struggle with that. My life is such that I need to compartmentalize and take time out in order to make time for that. So I'm really interested in how that works for people. I wonder what the roles of reverence and awe are in particular. Without knowing how it works, it's hard for me to imagine how sweeping my floor could inspire the reverence and awe. But it's all about perspective and staying present and being grateful in the moment and living gratefully and living presently. And so I think it probably intersects pretty squarely with the mindfulness movement and the idea that reality is the product of our consciousness. I'm really interested in all of this. Hopefully people will share their thoughts and reactions to this, and I hope you'll join me next Wednesday for a show all about crystals and magic. I'll explore whether there's a difference between crystal witchcraft and working with crystals, plus ways to incorporate them into your spell work, and talk in depth about my own work with crystals, some of my favorites right now, and suggestions for you. Thanks so much for being here. Take care, everyone.